I'll be honest with you, I like it when Norm has that many announcements. It's the closest I ever get to having him preach. Can't wait to hear what he has to say at 11 o'clock when he gets up there now. I'm also excited today. My wife got asked to go into the 2-year-olds today, so she's serving in the 2-year-olds. Has to bring our daughter to a soccer game at 11 so I can finally say whatever I want to about her. This is a great day. Don't tell her I said that. I don't have any stories about her. Today I want to talk about chaos and panic. Two things that I think we're probably familiar with, but let's define them real fast. Chaos is defined as complete disorder or confusion. Some of you may define life in similar sort of terms. Panic isn't so overarching. Panic is a sudden, uncontrollable fear or anxiety, often causing wildly unthinking behavior. Chaos is a state that you often live in, and panic is the response often to chaos. Panic can come quickly and disappear just as fast. Chaos is often a situation that we find ourselves enmeshed in. All of us know chaos and or panic. We've had moments or epochs of our lives where we have been stuck in chaos and moments of panic. Sometimes they're even linked. Chaos can create panic. Chaos can come in the form of diagnosis that was unexpected, a child in your family that is out of control, a lost job, financial disorder, systemic oppression, hunger. Chaos is often a season of life that is just completely uncontrollable, that overwhelms everything seemingly. This week we saw that chaos can even come in bizarre, fabricated manners. If you watch what's going on in the world at all like me, you would see that even the rich and famous have chaos. They worry about their children getting into college, and they pay off coaches and recruiters to get them in. It turns out that this sort of chaos is a felony. Who knew? I mean, Norm and I talked about this a lot this week. Back when we were kids, if you were rich and famous, you just paid the school to build a building and they let your kid in. Whatever happened to the good old days? We live in a world that's in chaos. The world has always been in chaos. It is, after all, subject to the fall and in sin. But with the increase of social media and 24-hour news network and cameras on phone, chaos unveils itself more and more regularly. And what we see, I think, in our world today is that the systems that we once trusted implicitly are themselves in chaos. And as such, people are looking for safety anywhere that they can find it. And so often what we define safety as isn't necessarily safety at all, but it's more like homogeny or similarity. We're trying to recreate new systems to shield us from the chaos of the world. We find security in political parties, nationalism, religious homogeny, echo chambers, tribalism. These sort of ways that we could just surround ourselves by people who think, look, act just like we do creates a false sense of safety, and it's the response of a world that's seeing its systems in chaos, trying to protect itself from itself. We also see panic in our world. I mentioned the news about the celebrities, but panic has happened this week as well. New Zealand is becoming increasingly diverse, and a person in response to their concern over religious and ethnic diversity shot up a Muslim temple. Now, that sort of behavior is, of course, unacceptable, whether Christian, Muslim, or otherwise. But it is a response to chaos. It is a panic. Panic is doing extreme things in response to not knowing what to do. We see panic in news stories about division. We see panic at a micro level in people's lives as they begin to experiment and express themselves sexually in order to find out who they are. We see that anxiety and depression is utterly through the roof everywhere. People are responding to the chaos around them, often by very self-destructive and communally destructive behaviors, trying to cope with seismic cultural shifts around them. Now, that's a 30,000-foot view, but we've also had chaos in our own lives. I could tell you some personal stories from childhood through now, and I will. As a child, I was constantly moving because I was a military child. That was chaotic as a little boy. As soon as I was to become comfortable with a new school, a new community, new friends, we would get transferred and moved. And not staying becomes a part of your identity as a child. I remember that when Desert Storm rose up in the early 1990s, there was tangible and realistic fear that my father would be deployed to the Middle East for war. That was chaos that a 10-year-old boy struggled to rationalize. Upon getting married and having children, Sharice and I lived in a short season of our lives where we were raising 2 children on $300 a week. That was chaotic. Not having enough money for basic needs creates a chaos that you struggle through in your relationships. As a pastor, there have been many seasons where I felt inadequate. I felt inadequate as a pastor, as a father, and as a husband. These seasons create broken relationship. It creates a sense of depression within yourself. You can't begin to see your way out of moments, eras of fear and brokenness and unsettledness. Many of you, if we were to open up the mic, could tell about seasons of utter chaos in your life where you struggled with places that weren't related because you didn't know where to place your chaos. Oftentimes, we panic as a result of chaos. We begin to get concerned, and fear really takes over, and it comes and it becomes definitive of who you are. Panic is often the result of chaos. We panic because we're afraid. And we panic and we do unruly, unnecessary, often very destructive things. Panic is that moment where you feel it welling from your stomach up and you feel like you have no options and you're just terrified and afraid. A couple moments of panic in my life include silly things like when I was a child, I used to like to climb trees. What little boy doesn't like to climb trees, right? But what I didn't like to do was climb down trees. And so I would climb to the top of the highest trees as a boy and sit up there for an hour, as boys are wont to do, and then I would go to take my first step down, and I would be overwhelmed with panic. All I could think about was the possibility of falling, breaking legs. The sort of security I felt going up, I didn't feel like going down. And so I would panic on the top of trees. And a panicked boy, the only thing a panicked boy really knows what to do on the top of a tree that they've climbed is cry out for their mommy. So my mom, in her 30s, climbed many trees just to help her poor panicked boy climb back down. I told you the story just a couple months ago about the birth of our firstborn child. We had a moment where we found out we were going to deliver our own child and we were going to do it in the driveway. That is panic-inducing. What do you do with these wild circumstances that you didn't create that are now very real in front of you? But the time I had the most panic is really about the dumbest thing I've ever done because I've got no explanation for anything that happened. It involves being pulled over by a police officer, of course. Please tell me you guys have been pulled over by a police officer before, right? Just a few of you. Great. So let me tell you about the time I thought I was going to get arrested. I had gone to a pastor's event where there was all sorts of speakers on leadership and how to lead a church. And it was just a really rich and fun day. And I went with my associate pastor, the first associate pastor I ever had. And it was so fun for me to have someone that I could talk through ministry with. And so she and I went together, drove an hour north in Ohio up to this event, spent about 7 hours listening to leaders. And on our way back, we were just so excited. It was great. We were just talking about all of the possibilities for the church that we had come in contact with in that day. And so as we're driving back through the rural roads of southwestern Ohio, I came to realize at a certain point that there was a police officer in my rearview mirror. And I was very confident that I had not done anything. And so I pulled over to let the police car go past me. Yeah, the officer stopped with me. And I began to think, well, what in the world could I have possibly have done? And so the officer comes and walks up to my window and gives this really uncomfortable gaze into the car. What is going on here? And he says, I should ask Victor about this someday. Why do police officers say stuff like this? But do you know why I've pulled you over? And I said, sir, I have no idea why you pulled me over. He says, well, how fast do you think you were going? And it was at that moment that I realized that I didn't even know what the speed limit was on the street. I'd just been engaged in talking, and I said, I'm really not sure. And he said, have you been listening to the radio very loud? Kind of a bizarre question is that, right? I said, no, the radio's off. Look. And he just stares at me and says, finally, he plays his cards, and he says, I've been following you for about 3 miles now. Yeah, oh, my word is right. That's what I thought. And I said to him, this is not a lie. I said, are you going to arrest me? And he laughed at me a little bit. He said, no, but you've been going like 20 miles an hour over the speed limit. And I've been following you for at least 3 miles, and you've neither slowed down nor pulled over. And I thought, this is really not good. You want to talk about panic-inducing? That's your moment. I was in full-on panic, and I just started apologizing, like, oh my goodness, what are you going to do to me? So I'm pulling out all of my stuff, and I find that I did not have an insurance card in the car. So not only have I been going 20 miles an hour over the speed limit, I've been followed by a police officer with lights on for 3 miles, and I don't have documents to prove that I'm legal to drive. And so I give him what I have, and he walks back to his car, and I'm very sure that my next phone call is going to be to my wife, asking her to come find me wherever I was. And the officer came back, and he was laughing. Well, of course he was laughing. It was probably the most ridiculous thing he'd ever seen in his life. And he gave me all my stuff and says, it all checks out, you can go. And I said, what? I can go? You owe me something, right? And he said, this story is too ridiculous not to be true. Just drive safe on the way home and pay attention to police officers. And he let me go, which is the most amazing act of grace I've ever received in my life. Imagine believing with all of your heart that you belong in jail and finding out that you've been sent on your way home. Yeah, wow is right. But panic, I was in panic. The story today that we're going to read from Matthew chapter 8 is a story of chaos and the disciples responding with panic. We should be able to identify ourselves very easily with the disciples in this story. Their story is our story. And Jesus responds to them in a really fascinating way, in a way that I hope is instructive to us as we learn to live in these chaotic times. What is it that Jesus is asking us to do as his people in response to chaos all around us? We're going to look at Matthew chapter 8, verses 23 to 27. I invite you to stand with me as we honor the reading of the word of the Lord. Matthew chapter 8, verses 23 to 27. Then he, Jesus, got into the boat, and his disciples followed him. Without warning, a furious storm came up on the lake, so that the waves swept over the boat. But Jesus was sleeping. The disciples went and woke him, saying, "Lord, save us! We're going to drown!" He replied, "You have little faith. Why are you so afraid?" Then he got up and rebuked the winds and the waves, and it was completely calm. The men were amazed and asked, "What kind of man is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. Foxes have dens and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. Jesus says this in the text right before the one we've read. Real inspiring stuff from a leader who's asking people to follow him. Foxes have dens and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. In spite of this wildly ineffective promotional speech, people still come up to Jesus telling him that they would like to follow him. One, in fact, is recorded as standing forward and saying, "Hey, listen, I just have to go back and bury my father. As soon as I do that, I'll follow you wherever you go." And Jesus gives the most peculiar response to that. He says basically, "Let the dead bury their own dead. Follow me." I can't express to you how bizarre of a response that is from Jesus. Not only because it rings as bizarre to us in 2019 America, but it would have rung particularly bizarre to first century Israel. Nothing was more fundamentally important to Jewish life than caring for your parents in their old age. You'll recall that one of the 10 Commandments is honor your father and your mother. And the real understanding of that in cultural context of the time was to take care of your parents when they couldn't take care of themselves anymore. And so that often meant old age retirement when their bodies began to fail. And death and burial would have been fundamental to taking care of your parents. And so this person is coming up to Jesus and saying, I've got a religious obligation. I've got a cultural obligation. Once I take care of this, then I will follow you. And Jesus denies him. Let the dead bury their own dead. The cost of following Jesus really is laying everything down. And the story we read today is fascinating because in spite of this bizarrity, this strange promotional speech, and this bizarre interaction with a person who wants to follow Jesus but has just one more hang-up, we're told immediately that the disciples followed him. Don't miss that in the first verse. The disciples followed him after getting a speech of the cost of following Jesus. They're doing something right. Jesus says, follow me, and the text is clear. The disciples are following him, and they follow him onto a boat out into the lake. Now, we live in a world with high-tech yachts and motors and power, weather systems on our phone. We can predict what's going to happen in the next hour, and our boats can carry through some incredible storms and choppy weather. This was not the case in first century Israel. In fact, jumping onto a boat meant you had nowhere to go. You were optionless. You were at the beg of the water. Whatever the water wanted to do is what your future was. And the disciples were signing off to jump onto the boat, to go into what was understood in their culture to be chaos. Water was not understood to be a nice vacation resort like we understand it today. Like a nice day on a boat sounds like a good time to us. But for them, water was understood as the embodiment of chaos in their world. So to jump on a boat and to go into water was to enter into chaos. Water is, we know, unruly, and was far less conquerable in that day than it is today. So Jesus calls them to jump on a boat with him, to go out into chaos, and to leave Israel and go across the sea into Gentile land. When the disciples, as we're told, follow him, they are radically in obedience to what Jesus is asking for them. Don't miss that. But upon getting into the boat to go out on this missional trip to the Gentiles across the other side of the sea, the worst of their fears of the chaos of the water comes. A storm comes and begins to rock their boat. And it rocks their boat to an incredible place that the water starts rising up over the top of the ship. If you've been boating before, you know this is about as bad as it can get. You cannot have water coming into the ship. And if the water is rocking underneath you enough and it's coming out over the top of you, it is time to panic. The disciples do just that. But they use really bizarre language to do it. You see, they're all up thinking that the boat is going down and their life is in danger, and so they go looking for the one that they call Lord. But the one that they call Lord doesn't quite seem to understand how boats work, because he's off in a corner taking a siesta. Have you ever been caught in the middle of a chaotic moment in your life where the best thing you can say about God is that he's asleep on the job? Have you been there before? I imagine many of us in this room have been there before. Life is so much, it's so difficult, it's so out of order, it's so backwards from the way we would design life to be if we could. Chaos is real, and life is shaking, and it is taking on water, and we say, "Where are you, Lord?" We can identify with the disciples here. We've been the disciples in this story before. And so Jesus gets woken up from his lovely nap. If you've ever slept on a boat before, you know that a little rocking kind of feels like a cradle from your childhood. It's a good sleep. And Jesus is enjoying his sleep. But he's woken up by the cries of the disciples, "Lord, save us. We're going to drown." And Jesus once again responds with the most bizarre words that we could possibly figure that he would say. "You of little faith, why are you so afraid?" Well, let me tell you why I'm afraid. The boat is rocking and water is coming in. We are going to drown. Their fear shouldn't be surprising to us until we take a moment and look at that first word which they address Jesus. Lord. They didn't say, "Hey, Jesus. Hey, Mary's kid." Lord, they said. This word Lord is such a powerful word in its cultural context. You see, to say that Jesus is Lord specifically meant that you were cutting against the cultural narrative of the time, which was that Caesar is Lord. People would greet one another in the Roman world of this time, shake hands and say, "Caesar is Lord." Yes, Caesar is Lord. Caesar was Lord because he was powerful. He was approved by the gods. He spoke and things happened. And people wanted to get in good graces with Caesar because people love to be around power. But these disciples have chosen to follow Jesus into chaos, and upon finding themselves in the middle of chaos, they address him as Lord. They expect that there is power in his voice. They expect that he can do something about their situation. But even in their expectation that he could do something about their situation, there's just a little bit about them that's saying, "I don't know that he can do something about this. This is something he's never seen before. This trouble that I'm in right now is more than Jesus can handle." But still, as if a last-ditch effort, they say to him, "We're going to drown. Help us out." And Jesus gets up, and after rebuking the disciples, he rebukes the wind. So with the same power that he shoots down their fear in the middle of chaos, with the same power that he says you don't need to panic when the world feels chaotic and out of control, he rebukes the winds, and the winds respond. And the disciples look at one another, and they begin to mutter to each other, "Who is this guy?" Now, they had faith. They had gotten it right. They followed Jesus. They called him Lord. There's so much about the disciples that they had gotten right. But now they were really seeing who he was. Who is this guy that even the winds and the waves obey him? Now don't miss this double use of the word rebuke. The disciples are rebuked, the winds are rebuked. The winds know better than to not listen to Jesus. The question is, do the disciples? The winds respond to Jesus. Jesus speaks to winds and waves, and they stop. The question we are confronted with is, do we, as those who follow Jesus, listen when he speaks? The next text is instructive too. If you were to carry right on to the next story, they get to the other side of the sea, and they're now in Gentile territory, and demon-possessed men come and find their way to Jesus. The demons are attracted to Jesus, and they say, listen, dude, we know who you are. I know you're here. You're going to do bad things to us, but could you just throw us into the pigs? It could be way worse than that. And so Jesus does exactly that. He casts them out of the people, and he throws them into the pigs. And of course, all of the local people who had counted on these pigs for economy throw Jesus out of town, put him back on the ship, and he has to go back to the other side. The disciples have had quite a day. They've seen Jesus calm wind and waves. They've seen him cast out demons. They've seen pigs run off of a cliff. They've seen a local uprising of the wealthy of this town, and now they're heading back to where they begun. They have seen a lot. But the question that remains right in front of them is, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about who Jesus is? What are you going to do about the power that he has over panic and chaos? When the world is at its absolute worst, when it's completely out of control, and you are at the point even of staring death in the face, Jesus can show up and reverse the course. That is a powerful, powerful force in this world. We continue today to pray to Jesus in the same exact sort of way that the disciples did here. Chaos is ensuing, Lord. I'm in a panic. Help! Save us! We're gonna drown! Our prayers can often sound just like this, and we can wonder, where are you, Lord? I'm always fascinated by music business, the work of poetry, the composing of sound. Elvis Costello is a musician that predates me a little bit, and so I didn't really listen to him growing up, but I kind of run into him a little later in life. He put an album out in 1984 called Goodbye Cruel World, and it was awful. Just really, really bad. And there's a song on there that becomes really interesting as time moves on called the Deportees Club. It is awful. I mean, it's literally a terrible song. There is squealing in the song. It's angry in tone. It's mediocre musically. It's really bad music. And it was put out in this really strange time. If you know Elvis Costello at all, there's kind of a strange sort of sound to him. It's not clean and pure. But this album was put out in the shadow of Michael Jackson rising to fame. Michael Jackson was putting out musically pure albums. The cymbals were clean, the beats were pure, perfection was demanded. And Elvis Costello tried to meet that demand of perfection. And he fell incredibly short, not only because it wasn't him, but because his heart wasn't into it. He wasn't ready. They were putting out a record because they were told to make a hit, and that's what musicians have to do. So 9 years later, in 1994, for some reason that no one really knows, he re-released this album. And if you were to buy the re-release of this album in 1994 and opened up the case and read the notes to Elvis Costello's re-release of Goodbye Cruel World, you would find a note in there from Elvis Costello that began like this: "Congratulations, you have just bought our worst record." Thanks. But what's interesting is that on that re-release, which was never widely released and was released by a different company even, that song, The Deportees Club, the squealing, angry, mediocre song, got renamed and reworked, and it was called just now Deportee. No longer the Deportees Club, just Deportee. And the sound was radically different, and the words were changed and mixed. And recently, Malcolm Gladwell, who's an author, brought that song, he's a big Elvis Costello fan, brought it to the producer of the Bad album and played that song for the producer. And the producer listened and remembered their effort in 1984. And his response was this: "It sounds like he found the song." That's powerful language. To say, we put something out there before and it fell short, but with 9 years of time, he found the song. Malcolm Gladwell's response to this is that the song hadn't yet found its genius. The song Hallelujah by Leonard Cohen has a very similar history. Now, you all know that song, Hallelujah. Leonard Cohen wrote it. He gets credited for it. His estate gets big money because everyone plays it, from college students with a guitar to pentatonics. That song is widely played. But if you were to go back and listen to the original recording of Hallelujah, it's awful. It's synthy and it's tinny and it's really bizarre. And Leonard Cohen really could never even land on what the lyrics were to this song. In fact, at different points in his life, you could find that he had 17 pages of lyrics for that one song. 17 pages of lyrics for one song. And it wasn't until a better musician with a smoother voice found that song and began tinkering with it. And then another musician who heard that better recording, wanting to return to the original biblical language that he put in there, changed the words back to an original language. It wasn't for 15 to 20 years before that song went from bizarre, synthy, unfinished recording to the beautiful song that we hear so often today. It took time and it took energy and it took people playing and messing with it before it finally found where it belonged. Axl Rose in the song November Rain has a similar story. Axl Rose was the lead singer of Guns N' Roses, and of course they were famous for flamboyant, loud, heavy rock, but Axl Rose was a trained pianist. So for all of his wild personality and incredibly out there concerts, Axl Rose's passion was often getting behind a piano. And he had this song, November Rain, that he was working on. And the entire time of Guns N' Roses' run, he was working on this song. And he would go after the concerts to the piano in lobbies at hotels that he was at. And he would play November Rain, and people would gather around for free concerts. And they would say, "Axl, why haven't you guys released this song? This song is great." And Axl would always say to them, "It isn't finished yet." Well, if you know that song, you know that it's like 8.5, 9 minutes long, and it never stops. It just keeps going and going and going. And finally, the producers pushed him to say, "You're done, release the song." But Axl never believed that it was done. He never thought that the song was complete. 9 minutes later. The disciples here aren't very much different. It's interesting to watch them in this situation get it about half right. They choose to follow him. They go into chaos trusting Jesus. When chaos comes, they call him Lord, understanding that he has power even over what faces it for them. But yet they can't help but panic to emerge. And Jesus looks at the panic that they're exuding, and he points right at it, and he says, "There, right there." That's very little faith. And then he does exactly what they need, exactly what they're yearning from him. He exerts his power in exactly the way that they're asking him to do. You see, here's the thing. The disciples would end up going on to do incredible things. I mean, this sort of casting out demons and healing people and proclaiming the good news, they would do the sort of things that Jesus did with incredible power because they trusted in the one who even the winds and the waves listened to. But they're not there yet. Right now, they're in a place of rebuke from Jesus. Jesus gives them as harsh a word as he gives the chaos. You may find yourself today in chaos. You may wish that you were stronger or better. You may wish that your faith was more fully put together. You may wish you were a couple steps down the road. You may hear Jesus' harsh word on the disciple and want to bury your head in your hands and say, "Oh, Jesus, that is me. I just don't have the faith that I should have." But here's the thing. Jesus still hears their prayer. Jesus doesn't give up on them. Unfinished product yet, but maybe he just looks at them similarly to how Elvis Costello or Axl Rose or Leonard Cohen looked at their work. They had absolute work of art and beauty that they had created, but it wasn't finished yet. And it was a piece of beauty that was worth pursuing until it got found to be right. I have a feeling that in our moments of weakness, when we panic, and we know better that we should just put our trust in God and say, "Carry me through the chaos, I trust you." I know that we all are guilty of panic in those difficult times. But if we see anything about these disciples who get it close to right but not quite right, Jesus doesn't give up on them. He's not done. His frustration with their lack of faith isn't an end of relationship. And it certainly doesn't preclude him from helping them deal with the chaos in front of them. And so in these days, as we head towards Easter, as we begin to gear up within our soul and our hearts to prepare for the joy of the resurrection, if you're not feeling like you measure up to all that Jesus is, I say to you, it's okay. God's still working on you. But what we can do for sure, starting today, that's just like the disciples. They may not get it right. They may not say the right words. They may be incomplete. But boy, did they follow him onto that ship. What we have within our power is not to get it right every time. We fall short. We make mistakes. We don't have our faith in order at all times. But the disciples followed Jesus, even into chaos. They trusted that he would care for them. And when things got tough, their trust may have shook a little bit. But Jesus was faithful to care for them if they would just follow him. So my invitation to you today, as the band comes out, as we sing this final song, stop being so hard on yourselves. Don't think that you have to get yourself in order. Don't think that you have to straighten some things out before you can come to Jesus. Jesus invites you to follow him right where you're at. You're not going to get it right. The disciples didn't get it right, but Jesus was faithful to help them through their chaos. And so long as they kept following, Jesus kept working on them. You and I, we're no different than the disciples. We don't always have it in the right order. We don't always say the right things. We don't always trust as fully as we would like to. But those shortcomings and mistakes have nothing to do with whether or not Jesus stays faithful to us. So there may be some in here today who are wrestling with chaos. They're in the middle of a storm, and they identify with the disciples. Where are you? Why are you sleeping, God? Do you see what I'm going through? Jesus may be sleeping because he knows the end of the story. He's got you covered. He sees you. He's filled with love for you. And all he asks is for you to follow him. Sometimes that means deeper into the chaos, yes, but he is faithful to care for you even in the worst of storms. So if you'd like to bring your chaos, your struggle, your moment to God, we're going to sing this great song, a song I love about stepping out into faith, into oceans. And it matches the water theme of what we read today. But if you'd like to come forward and pray about the chaos you find yourself in, you will find that Jesus sees and that he has a plan to help you through. Would you stand with me as we sing?